Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we are walking the streets of Pompeii before the sky turned dark. What did an ordinary day look like in a city that felt safe under a quiet mountain? How did people work, eat, shop, worship, and rest when life seemed steady and predictable? Imagine dawn on warm stone streets. Bakers turn the mills and shape rings of bread. Steam rises from public baths where friends trade news. At corner counters, the thermopolia clay jars keep wine and stew ready for anyone passing by. In elegant houses, gardens shimmer with pools and painted walls, while small household shrines glow with oil lamps for the spirits of the home. The forum fills with voices. Merchants weigh goods. Fish sauce in sealed jars waits for buyers. Cloth workers pound fabric clean at the Phalonica. Water runs through fountains fed by hidden channels, and lead pipes hum with a steady flow. Children chase each other across mosaics. A flute echoes from a courtyard lesson. On the edge of town, the amphitheater rests, its seats warming in the sun, while vineyards and orchards stretch toward the sea. On these walls, scribbles of love notes, jokes, and election slogans tell us what people cared about. In these rooms, loaves left in ovens, jewelry tucked in chests, and everyday tools laid aside for tomorrow remind us that no one knew what was coming. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you are here to unwind or to drift into sleep, I am glad you joined me. Now, let us begin. Begin on a low shelf of land that once felt the tide. In antiquity, the shoreline of the Bay of Naples lay farther inland than it does today, and the mouth of the Sarno River opened a broad estuary. On a tongue of ground between the river and a dark ridge of ancient lava, people speaking an italic tongue that scholars call Oscan raised huts, tended fields, and watched the mountain that later generations would name Vesuvius. The soil under their sandals was a gift of deep time. Ash and cinder from earlier eruptions had weathered into a loam that took seed readily and returned generous harvests of grain, legumes, olives, and vines. The Sarno provided fresh water, a route to the sea, and a silted terrace that could cradle a landing place. Geography wrote the first lines of Pompeii's story. Archaeology gives these early inhabitants a material voice. On the plateau and along the slopes toward the future city center, excavators have found traces of post holes, simple hearths, handmade pottery, and later wheel-made wares that mark a steady transition from scattered farmsteads to a nucleated settlement. Burial customs and language place these pioneers within the broader Osco-Umbrian world of south-central Italy. Their personal names, later caught on the walls in Oscan script, belong to that family of Italic speech. At first, the community was small and its dwellings modest, but even modest people choose strong ground. The earliest fortification line took advantage of the natural topography. Builders traced sections of wall along the crest of an old lava flow. They did not name the rock that crumbled under their picks. They had no geological theory. They simply knew a high place is easier to defend, and that stone cut from cooled lava makes durable masonry. Across the water, Greek sailors had already seeded the Tyrrhenian with colonies. One of the earliest, on the island we call Ischia, was known in Greek as Pithekusai. On the mainland, the powerful city of Cumae rose on a tufa hill facing the bay. These Greeks brought with them letters, weights and measures, coinage, and a taste for painted pottery that found eager buyers throughout Campania. Fragments of Greek cups and mixing bowls appear among the earliest imports in the Pompeian region. They tell a story of contact and appetite. A farmer who walks into a market with a basket of grapes can leave it with a glazed cup from Corinth or Athens. From such simple exchanges grow new habits in tableware, new words in the local speech, and new deities in the neighborhood shrines. Religious life is one of the clearest registers of this early encounter. The hill above the future, triangular forum, preserves the footprint of a 6th century temple in the archaic Doric manner. Close by, near the later civic forum, a sanctuary to Apollo took shape with columned porticos and an altar that would endure into the Roman era. Dedications and statuary speak of a cult that is Greek in iconography and ritual tone, yet made local by the hands that carved it and the magistrates who paid for it. To an Oscan farmer, Apollo is not a foreign god. He is a powerful neighbor who accepts offerings at the planting and again at the harvest, who guards the harbor, and who lends prestige to the families that sponsor his festivals. The town plan that emerges in this period is a palimpsest of practical choices and borrowed ideas. Streets still follow the natural lines of the ridge and the river terrace rather than any strict grid. Houses turn inward to sheltered courtyards that catch light and breeze, a Mediterranean answer to heat and dust. Workshops front the lanes. The presence of a landing place on the Sarno is more than a convenience. It is the engine of growth. Amphorae arrive full of wine and oil from other Campanian estates and from farther afield. New pottery forms come in with them, and so do notions of style that patrons ask local painters to imitate. What we would call globalization is already at work along the bay. To speak of prosperity is not to imagine luxury everywhere. Most people still earn their bread by tending vines and trees on small plots outside the walls, driving pigs through oak woods for mast, and carrying baskets of produce to market. Yet prosperity has a way of leaving civic fingerprints. In the later archaic period, the community invests in stronger walls, stout gates, and open spaces that begin to resemble a forum. You can measure confidence by stone. Investment in permanent building, in dressed blocks and formal colonnades, tells us that people believed their town had a future. It also tells us they had something to protect. The neighbors of Pompeii were not only Greek. To the north, Etruscan power reached into Campania during the 7th and 6th centuries. Etruscan merchants and artisans left marks in burial styles and metalwork, and for a time Etruscan elites exerted influence over cities in the plain. The Oscan Pompeians lived at a crossroads of cultures and learned to navigate among them, sometimes submitting, sometimes trading, always borrowing what proved useful. The result by the 5th century is a settlement that looks both local and cosmopolitan. It speaks Oscan in the streets, whispers Greek in the sanctuaries, and bargains with Etruscan traders over bronze and wool. Agriculture underwrites everything. The vines on the lower slopes of the mountain and along the Sarno were already famous in Roman times for their strength and flavor, and there is no reason to doubt that the early Oscan farmers understood the combination of volcanic soil, sea, air, and careful pruning that makes a vineyard thrive. Olive trees took longer to mature, but once they did, the press houses could work through the autumn, sending jars downriver to the landing, then out along the coast. The river itself was a teacher. Each flood laid down new silt on the low ground, and with each season the farmers learned where to place a dike or cut a channel. The town learned the same lesson at scale. It sited its walls on high ground, bridged the wet places with stone, and let the river pay the cost of fertilizing the fields. Daily life in this early period was neither primitive nor isolated. Tools of iron sharpened plowshares and shears. Loom weights speak to household textile production. Little terracottas of deities and animals suggest both piety and play. The palette of paints used on temple and house began to brighten under Greek influence. Even cooking changed. Imported pots, shaped for Greek recipes, share shelves with local forms. In such details, we see a community that kept its footing while the world beyond the bay moved. By the later 5th century, the town that would be Pompeii had become a fixture on the Campanian map. It had a recognized civic center, sanctuaries with patrons and calendars, a perimeter of walls, and the beginnings of a port economy. Its citizens understood that their fortunes were tied to wider currents. They had learned from Greeks and bargained with Etruscans. They had watched strangers arrive by water and had sent their own sons out as sailors and traders. They did not yet imagine Roman magistrates presiding in their forum, nor veterans settled on their streets, nor the mountain above them waking in fury. They knew only that the land was fertile, the river was useful, and the world beyond the bay could be both generous and demanding. If there is a single truth in these beginnings, it is that Pompeii did not spring full-formed from Roman policy. It grew out of the choices of Oscan farmers and artisans who exploited a good site and took every advantage of contact with powers greater than themselves. They did so with a shrewd eye for terrain, a reverence for the gods who seemed to favor their hill, and a willingness to adopt the tools and tastes that trade laid before them. In that sense, Pompeii was already Roman long before Rome arrived. It was pragmatic, adaptive, and anchored in place. The first shift in Pompeii's fortunes came from the north. Across the Campanian plain, the Etruscans had built a web of power that reached from their heartland into the fertile lands around the bay. They traveled with artisans and merchants, with bronze founders and builders who knew how to set great blocks in orderly ranks. Their presence in Campania is written in tombs and metalwork, and in the habits of civic life that grip a town long after armies withdraw. Pompeii felt that touch. You see it in imported goods laid in graves, in the occasional borrowing of Etruscan motifs, and in the simple fact that the town was now part of a larger story along the Tyrrhenian coast. The Etruscans were not the only sea-facing power in the region. To the west lay Greek Cumae, and beyond it a chain of Greek colonies that ringed the southern shores of Italy. For generations, these two cultures tested one another in trade and in battle. The tipping point came in the early 5th century when the tyrant of Syracuse, Hiero, sailed north to aid Cumae. In a hard-fought action off the coast in the year that later historians would mark as 474 before the Common Era, an Etruscan fleet met its defeat. The outcome did not erase Etruscan culture in Campania, but it loosened the bonds of Etruscan power and opened space for new actors. In the valleys and uplands east of the plain lived the Samnites, highland peoples who spoke Oscan as Pompeii's first settlers did, and who watched the rich soils of Campania with a shepherd's shrewd eye. The Samnites were mountain folk who moved with the seasons. Their flocks practiced a long rhythm of pasture, coming down into the plains when the grasses ripened and retreating to upland meadows in the heat. Such movements make for hard men and skilled small unit fighters. They also foster webs of kinship that can expand quickly into leagues and confederations when opportunity appears. In the later 5th century, that opportunity did appear. The weakening of Etruscan hegemony let Samnite groups establish themselves in the plain, at first as hired hands and garrison troops, then as rulers in their own right. In time, the very word Campani would come to mean communities whose elite drew on Samnite blood but lived among Greek and Etruscan cousins, wearing Greek ornaments and speaking Oscan in public. Pompeii stood on a ridge of ancient lava with a runnable river at its feet. Any people intent on holding the plain would want a post there to watch the Sarno mouth and the approach to the bay. The Samnites took the town and they did not abandon it. Instead, they set about making it their sort of place. Fortifications were strengthened along the natural high ground. By the 4th century, the circuit that tourists walk today had taken recognizable shape. a defensive line of roughly 3 kilometers with stout towers and a suite of gates that opened toward Herculaneum, Stabiae, New Syria, and the coast. Stone was quarried from nearby tufa beds and from the Sarno limestone. Masonry blocks laid in regular courses testify to a community prepared to spend wealth on permanence. In Campania, one measures confidence by the thickness of the wall. Religion was refitted rather than erased. The older sanctuary to Apollo retained its dignity, but the city also developed cult places that spoke to the tastes of the new rulers and to the broad Hellenic fashion that had by now soaked the region. On the high corner that would later be called the Triangular Forum, an archaic Doric temple looked across the river mouth to the bay. Outside the walls, sanctuaries gathered offerings from sailors and farmers alike. The marshy hollow known today as Fondo Iosino yielded deposits of weapons and inscribed vessels that suggest a lively mixing of Greek and Oscan worship. The dedications tell us that men who moved by sea and men who worked the land made vows at that water's edge. It was a place where a town spoke to its gods about safety and success in an unsettled world. The shape of the town within the walls changed as well. The Samnite period in Pompeii coincides with what archaeologists call a Hellenistic urban moment. The phrase points to a blend of Italic tradition and Greek city making that Campanian elites embraced. Streets straightened where they could. Open spaces took on porticos. Public buildings added colonnades that created shaded corridors for business and politics. In the broad space that would become the Forum, magistrates erected a tribunal where they could sit in state and hear disputes. The earliest version of the basilica and the later law courts belonged to a later age, but the habit of using a central rectangle as the heart of civic life is already evident. The houses of Pompeii record this change even more clearly. On lanes climbing from the river to the ridge, domestic architecture settled on the Italic courtyard plan that scholars call the atrium house. The earliest examples are modest. A visitor would enter a vestibule and step into a central room open to the sky, where rain fell through a rectangular opening and was caught in a shallow basin. Light and air pooled there, and rooms gathered around it. By the 3rd century, one can point to grander examples. The house of the surgeon, with its careful masonry and measured rooms, belongs to this period and tells us that patrons in Samnite Pompeii were commissioning builders to give them comfort and status. Later masterpieces such as the House of the Faun would raise the standard again with Greek-style peristyles and lavish mosaics, but their roots lie in a Samnite city that had learned to live generously. Commerce moved in step. Campania was the garden of Italy, and Samnite Pompeii sat close to the mouth of a navigable river. Amphorae for wine and oil crowd, the archaeological record of the region. Black gloss pottery from Greek workshops appears in quantity, then is imitated by local kilns that master the sheen. Dress accessories copy Etruscan forms, and then take on Campanian quirks. The market quarter south of the Forum filled with shops whose counters opened directly onto the street. In such workshops, stones were cut, sandals stitched, and jars of olives brined and sold. A town that strengthens its walls and refines its houses is a town confident enough to extend credit and to plan next year's harvest on more than hope. The Samnites did not live in a quiet corner. Their ascendancy in the plain brought them into conflict with other Campanian elites, and then with a new power rising from the Latin hills. Rome in the 4th century had outgrown the small farmer city of its myths and had begun to look south. The First Samnite War started over control of a nearby upland city. Though the first conflict ended without decisive change, it set the pattern for the struggles that followed. The Latin War, which broke the autonomy of Rome's old Latin allies, tightened Roman organization. The Second Samnite War revealed how formidable highland fighters could be against legions marching through narrow country. In that struggle, Roman writers remembered a humiliation in a mountain pass, where the Romans were forced to lay down their arms and file beneath a yoke. Mountain warfare had its own cruel arithmetic. Yet wars end, and they often end in favor of the side that can put men in the field year after year, build roads to supply them, and replace losses with fresh recruits. In the end, Rome learned the ground, adapted its tactics, and wore down its foe. Through these decades, Pompeii sat in a corridor between mountain and sea. The town supplied grain, oil, wine, and recruits. It watched columns tramp the coastal road and heard news of victories and reverses carried to the forum by mule drivers and sailors. The alliance patterns in Campania shifted like currents. Capua, the great city of the plain, ordered the loyalties of lesser towns, and those loyalties were tested every time a new levy marched or a new treaty was signed. What Pompeii did in these years was what pragmatic towns always do. It fortified its walls. It invested in sacred places that could serve all parties. It courted patrons among the powerful. It looked after its river and its port, because a town with working quays can provision garrisons and profit from the movement of armies. Archaeology allows us to see beyond the political map. Street fronts in the Samnite layers are punctuated by narrow doorways that open into deep shops. Behind many of these shops lies a courtyard with a cistern and a small shrine. Graffiti in Oscan letters stick to these levels, scratched into plaster before Latin public notices replace them. Tombs outside the walls align along the roads that lead to the gates, a reminder that in Italic custom the dead marked the approaches to the living city. The necropolis along the road to Herculaneum begins to take on its familiar form as family groups define space with low enclosures and stelae. These monuments are not grand, but they show pride and continuity. Names recur across generations. A town whose dead are carefully tended is a town that believes it belongs where it stands. It is tempting to imagine Samnite Pompeii as a backwater overshadowed by the bright lights of Greek Naples and the great estates of Capua. The material record tells a different tale. This was a community that absorbed influences from every point on the compass and turned them to its advantage. It learned the Greek way of setting a colonnade and the Etruscan way of carving a lintel. It kept its Oscan tongue in the courts and on the walls, and wore Greek ornaments at festivals. It drank wine at tables laid with black gloss cups and served that wine from jars made in local kilns. It watched foreign soldiers pass and measured its words in public, as towns do when empires pinch them. By the time Rome enters the written record of Pompeii in the early 3rd century, the foundations of the city are already set. The walls stand on their lava ridge. The gates open onto roads that tie the town to its neighbors. The sanctuaries hold their festivals. The forum is the recognized place for business and proclamation. House plans display a confidence that can afford measured beauty. What remained to come were the pressures of larger imperial politics and the wholesale refounding that would follow a disastrous rebellion. That future belongs to another chapter. For the moment, in the last century before Pompeii's first mention by Roman writers, the town is a Samnite city of Campania, secure enough to invest in stone, devout enough to fill its altars, and savvy enough to trade with anyone who comes up the Sarno with a cargo and a coin purse. When Rome looked south across the Campanian plain in the 3rd century before the Common Era, it found a landscape already rich in cities, fields, and harbors. On the lava shelf above the Sarno mouth, Pompeii stood among these communities as a fortified Samnite town with Greek tastes, Oscan speech, and Etruscan habits still visible in stone and ritual. Rome's long struggle with the Samnites drew the Campanian towns, willingly or not, into the orbit of a republic that was learning to manage allies as carefully as it commanded legions. The bargain that emerged was an instrument of Roman genius. cities like Pompeii would remain communities with their own councils, festivals, and local laws. In return, they would become soci of Rome, bound to provide troops, supplies, and loyalty. Citizenship would wait. Taxation would be assessed through treaties. Prestige would be borrowed from the city on the Tiber and repaid in grain, men, and obedience. Archaeology lets us watch the practical results of this alliance. Roads, the quiet infrastructure of power, link Pompeii more tightly to the Campanian network. The old coastal and river routes thicken with milestones and way stations tied to the great Roman arteries that reach Capua and beyond. Porters carry amphorae stamped with makers' marks that can be traced to distant kilns. Black gloss tableware from Campanian factories becomes common in Pompeian houses, followed by new Italian forms that imitate and adapt Greek shapes. The town's coin use reflects the monetary revolution that Rome advanced around the Western Mediterranean. Silver coin enters local circulation in larger quantities, and with it, a fine-grained cash economy that makes markets more efficient, rents more calculable, and taxes easier to collect. The Forum Square, still an irregular rectangle that reflected the old topography, begins to function as a Roman-style civic stage. Magistrates who once posted decrees in Oscan now share public space with officials who know Latin formulas and Roman calendar days. Bilingual inscriptions survive from this period, a reminder that legal change on the frontier of empire often arrives as a dialogue rather than a decree. Some house fronts acquire new facades with measured facades that anticipate the monumental programs of a later century. The town is still Samnite in law and in the names scrawled on its walls, but the civic performance increasingly follows Roman cues. To the west, the growth of Puteoli transforms Campanian trade. That harbour, favoured by the winds and by Roman policy, becomes the principal entrepot for Italian commerce with the Greek world and with Egypt. The ships that call at Puteoli do not neglect smaller markets. The Sarno mouth is a short sail away. Pompeii's vintners and oil pressers could now move their produce through a traffic system that multiplied customers and profits. The amphorae for Pompeian wine adopt shapes that are recognized across the sea. Amphora stamps and tituli picti, the painted labels on jar shoulders, show the spread of Campanian brands and the rise of merchant families who parlay agricultural capital into political prominence. The Second Punic War sends a chill through this prosperity. When Hannibal crosses the Alps and brings fire to Italy, the great Campanian city of Capua defects to the Carthaginian side and pays for it later with Roman vengeance. The coast sees raids and alarms. Nearby, Nuceria suffers grievously. Pompeii's location on the Sarno and its status as an allied town make it a supplier and a watcher. Garrisons move. Grain levies are enforced. The vineyards ripen under a sky that may at any hour show unfamiliar sails. The evidence from Pompeii for these years is marked less by the scars of sack than by the hardening of stone. Walls are maintained. Gates and towers show care. In uneasy times, cities invest in perimeter and storehouses. The 2nd century brings a new kind of Campanian wealth, less dramatic but more pervasive. Fine farms thicken in the countryside, each with presses, storage jars, and the staff to run them. Villas, some suburban and some rural, begin to experiment with a language of luxury that will become the glory of the 1st century. Mosaic floors of simple black and white appear in houses that 2 generations earlier would have been content with beaten earth and painted plaster. The atrium house evolves gently. A rear garden court with colonnades, the peristyle, is added to some properties. This is a Greek grammar fitted to an italic sentence. In Pompeii, the fit is surprisingly natural. If the material record speaks of order, the political record shows strains. Across Italy, the Allies chafed at the limits of the bargain with Rome. Their young men marched in Roman armies, bled in Roman wars, and returned to towns that could not share in the citizenship that opened the doors of Roman courts and Roman patronage. Resentment hardened into a movement whose language became simple and irresistible. If we bear the burdens of the Republic, we should share its rights. The story of that demand is the social war, and Pompeii plays a visible part. The triggers are familiar. A proposal to extend citizenship more widely is defeated in Rome through a mixture of obstruction and fear. A prominent Italian leader is murdered. The Allies take up arms. In the year 91 before the Common Era, the insurgent coalition forms a capital at Corfinium in the Abruzzi and renames it Italia. They mint coin that proclaims an Italian state. The map of central and southern Italy, which had seemed stable for a generation, fractures along old lines. Town after town must choose. Pompeii, whose Oscan identity has never entirely vanished, and whose marketplace knows how much Campania has given to Rome, joins the revolt. This decision brings war to its gates. The social war is a conflict of sieges, skirmishes, and hard marches. Roman commanders, who will soon be household names, make reputations here. The most famous among them for Campania is Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician with a gift for speed and calculated brutality. In 89 he appears before Pompeii with discipline and modern engines. Excavations have recovered piles of round stone shot, the ammunition of catapults that once arced over the walls and shattered roofs and courage inside the town. The lava ridge that had made the early fortifications so efficient now works to Rome's advantage, for it fixes the geometry of attack and the angles for artillery. Siege banks and saps gnaw at the suburbs. The garrison fights. The markets empty. Those who can, take children and silver and go to kin in the countryside. One gains a sense of the siege not only from the scars in the masonry, but from the bureaucratic paper trail that war always leaves behind. Laws passed in Rome during these years offer citizenship to allies who remained loyal, and later to rebels who will lay down arms and register with a magistrate within a set number of days. The Lex Iulia of 90 offers the first wide opening. The Lex Plautia Papiria of 89 widens it further. Policy and cannonade move together. For many communities, this is enough. For Pompeii, it is not, at least not at once. The city holds out long enough to feel the weight of Sulla's hand. The cost is visible in the archaeological record. Repairs in later generations reuse odd blocks and sculptural fragments. A sure sign that once elegant buildings were shattered and then patched in haste. The outer faces of some towers show Roman tooling that is not part of the original Samnite fabric. Streets along the northeastern sector preserve traces of burned debris that does not match the later destruction of the eruption. There is also the silence that follows a broken resistance. The Oscan inscriptions become rarer. The names that appear on property markers, on weights, and on seals begin to skew Roman. For all that, the transition does not happen in a single season. War does not end the life of a city. Bakers reopen ovens because people must eat. Merchants begin to move wine again because vines do not stop producing while men argue. Around the forum, temporary stalls sell what the countryside can spare. The river carries barges because the current keeps running, and someone will always hire a boat to carry olive oil and tiles. There is a human steadiness in this period that a narrative of generals might miss. Families arrange marriages that will repair fortunes on both sides of an argument. Priests keep calendars and conduct the rites because harvests and vows are indifferent to politics. Builders finish a street paving begun before the first stones fell from Sulla's engines because a good pavement saves the ankles of a mule and spares the springs of a cart. In the last act of the social war, the Roman offer of citizenship becomes policy rather than promise. Italians gain the rights and duties of Roman citizens, first in a limited form that keeps many electoral privileges in the hands of Rome's traditional tribes, then in broader forms as the old political order adjusts to the new population. For Pompeii, this means entry into the legal frame of the Republic. Magistrates will now conduct business in Latin formulas. Courts will be expected to recognize Roman contracts and Roman inheritance rules. The tax register will reflect Roman categories. What the town will lose, soon enough, is a measure of autonomy. What it will gain is the protection and the burdens that come with being Roman. The decade closes with the city bruised and inward-looking, but not broken. The walls still stand on their lava ridge. The Forum still draws traders from the Sarno and petitioners from the farms. Houses continue to evolve in a direction that promises luxury for those who can pay for it. The countryside, with its famous soil, waits for peace to show what it can do in a stable market. Above all, the city waits for the man who besieged it to complete his ascent. Sulla will soon dominate Roman politics. When he does, he will return to Campania not as a general before hostile walls, but as master of the Republic, equipped with laws to settle veterans and rewards to grant to loyalists. That is the next turn of the story, and in Pompeii it will change street plans, voting rolls, and even the language of the stones. When the social war ended, Rome possessed not only a victory but also a program. The Republic knew how to turn triumph into structure. Confiscation, settlement, and a thorough rewriting of civic life were tools as familiar to Roman leaders as the legions themselves. Nowhere in Campania would these tools bite more cleanly than at Pompeii. In the year that follows the defeat of the rebels, Lucius Cornelius Sulla returns to the bay not as a besieger outside the walls, but as the master of Roman policy. He carries with him the power to seize and to settle, and a conviction that order is something you can pour into the streets of a city like wet concrete and let it set. The legal act is brief and decisive. Pompeii is refounded as a colony of Roman citizens with a name that folds politics, family pride, and piety into one formula: Colonia Cornelia Veneria Pompeianorum. Cornelia identifies the gens of Sulla. Veneria invokes the patron deity that Sulla favored, and the final word anchors the new law in the old soil. In practice, this means that a board of commissioners surveys the town and its territory, draws up a charter, and assigns urban properties and plots of farmland to settlers drawn from Sulla's veterans and loyalists. The technical Latin of the charter sets out a municipal constitution familiar to every Roman town from Spain to the Adriatic. There will be an ordo of local senators called decurions who sit in council at the basilica. There will be 2 chief magistrates who are duoviri iudicundo and who preside over courts and public business. 2 aediles will supervise markets, streets, and public order. Elections will be annual. Public accounts will be posted in the Forum. Rituals will be observed on the Roman calendar. Above all, the language of law will be Latin. You can track this change by the way the stones speak. Oscan inscriptions, which once crowded the walls of Pompeii, begin to recede into older levels. Bilingual texts survive here and there, a sign that the city's memory does not vanish overnight, but the new public voice is Roman. Names tell the same story. Where a property marker in the Samnite period might carry an Oscan gentilicium, the new ones introduce colonist families with Latin praenomina and nomina gentilicia. The very spelling of names turns into a small map of power. Men who had been recorded with Oscan letters now stand for office under Latin forms. The logic is simple and relentless. If you aspire to lead in a Roman colony, you must learn to be seen and heard as a Roman. Settlement is always more than parchment. Veterans arrive with their families and their habits. They bring a taste for specific entertainments and a sense that public magnificence is the sign of private success. They also bring clients and commercial ties from the camps and the campaigning roads. At Pompeii, these new citizens do not merely take over existing houses. They reshape the town. Property is surveyed, divided, and in some cases reassigned. Old proprietors who opposed Rome lose holdings within the walls and in the countryside beyond. Those who are allowed to remain often change their political posture in a hurry. Marriage alliances between colonists and established families thicken. Within a generation, the electoral walls show the new order, with painted appeals on street corners for men with Roman names backed by money that flows from farms, workshops, and loans. Public works are the most legible face of this reordering. The Forum is rationalized with porticos and standardized facades that supply a proper stage for the new magistrates. The Basilica, already a proud structure from the late 2nd century, is repaired and pressed into service as the courtroom and exchange of a colony that has new cases to hear and new contracts to write. Paving stones march across streets that once undulated with packed earth. The curb heights are regularized so that a cartwheel no longer breaks a spoke from one corner to the next. Stepping stones are placed at intervals so that a citizen in white can cross a busy lane without wetting his hem. Even the gutters bear witness to a new eye for order. They are cut straighter and deeper, and the silt traps at the corners are more carefully made. The emblem of the sullen refounding, however, stands not on the Forum but at the edge of town, where the lava ridge drops toward the river. In 70, before the Common Era, two men whose names ring through early colony politics, Gaius Quinctius Valgus and Marcus Porcius, put up a building that Rome had learned to love and that Pompeii would make its own. It is the amphitheater, and it is among the earliest permanent stone arenas in the Roman world. The dedicatory inscription makes clear that these benefactors were duoviri, who offered a gift to the colonists and to the local community. The form is bold and practical. Instead of burying a bowl into a hillside as the Greeks did for their theatres, the builders here ring an oval of ground with a wall and compact earthen banks, then tie the structure together with ramps, arches, and cages of masonry that support tiers of seating. The arena floor sits low so that spectators can look down upon the sand where fighters and hunters perform. Capacity estimates hover around 20,000 souls, a number that far exceeds the resident population of the town, and tells us that the amphitheater was a regional magnet. Country people and citizens from nearby cities would pour through the gates for the festivals. Vendors would spill across the field outside with cheap wine, roasted nuts, and souvenirs. On game days, the economy of a colony doubles. The amphitheater did work that was social as well as spectacular. Gladiatorial games were more than savage entertainment. They were engines of civic inclusion. Colonists and locals could sit side by side under a bright Campanian sky while a patron paid for the show and had his name shouted by a herald before the first trumpet. A city that has been taken and refounded needs rituals in which winners and losers can find a shared voice. Bread is important. Spectacle is indispensable. As the decades pass, the walls of Pompeii will fill with fevered graffiti that praise star fighters and insult rival towns. One day those passions will spill into a riot that earns a reprimand from the emperor. For now, the new arena performs its integrative role. Men who fought on opposite sides in the social war now cheer for the same retiarius and curse the same umpire. The colony also sponsors a second performance space of a different temper. A small roofed theatre rises near the larger open-air theatre on the south side of town. Its compact plan and covered seating create an intimate hall suited for declamation, musical performances, and civic ceremonies when sun or rain make the open cavea less welcoming. Here, the text becomes the spectacle. The voices of poets and local orators can carry to the back rows without strain. The patronage logic is the same as in the amphitheater. A donor builds. The city gathers. The name of the donor is engraved into stone and cemented into public memory. Religion adjusts to the new political reality with Roman ease. The colony's official title proclaims its devotion to Venus, a goddess Sulla had taken as patron in his climb to power. In Pompeii, that devotion takes brick and mortar form near the Porta Marina, where a temple of Venus looks seaward over the lower terraces. The cult is not new to Campania, where Greek Aphrodite had long enjoyed honors, but its prominence now ties a local sanctuary to the pedigree of the ruling family in Rome. Processions climb the slope on appointed days. Magistrates offer sacrifices at the altar. Mariners make vows in exchange for safe landfall at the river mouth. If one wants to see how religion and politics knit a colony together, one can watch a festival day when the Juaveri walk in white before the crowd and pour wine upon the steps of the goddess who has blessed their city and their careers. Domestic architecture registers the colony's appetite for status. The atrium house remains the basic form, but the scale grows and the finish improves along streets where colonists lay claim. Entrances widen to announce importance. Vestibules lengthen into corridors that frame the reveal of the central hall. Floors in the principal rooms are redone with mosaics of black and white tesserae, a sober and expensive fashion. Walls receive fresh plaster and a new generation of painted decoration that begins to experiment with illusionistic frames and floating panels. Courtyards in the rear become proper peristyles with colonnades that catch the breeze and guide views to fountains and carefully trained shrubs. These choices are not mere indulgence. They are investments in political capital. Voters visit houses. Clients line up in the mornings under these colonnades to greet their patrons and to receive the small gifts that keep loyalty warm. The private frame of a residence is used as a public instrument. Commerce moves with this architectural tide. The colony has more mouths and more money. Workshops multiply along the arteries that lead from the forum to the gates. Bakers enlarge their operations with stepped mills turned by donkeys and banks of ovens that can handle daily production for a neighborhood. Metalworkers repair agricultural tools and fashion fittings for doors and chests. Fullers set up shops, where tunics and cloaks are cleaned with water, clay, and the pungent ammonia that the city's urine jars provide. Wine producers push more amphorae to the Sarno quays, some stamped with names that will remain legible for archaeologists to read. The countryside feels these changes as estates adjust to a market that is wider and steadier. Press houses in the villas keep longer hours at harvest. Storage rooms swell with the heavy bellies of clay jars. If we could stand on a ridge above the river on a clear morning in the first generation of the colony, we would watch a file of mules pick a careful path toward the landing, while a small flotilla of riverboats bobbed at their moorings, ready to move the town's wealth to larger ships at Puteoli. Politics in a young colony has a particular flavor. There is a scramble as networks are made and remade. Ambitious men court both colonists and old families. Painted electoral notices appear on stuccoed walls in a hand that is at once formulaic and revealing. Supporters urge passers-by to vote for a candidate who is honest, generous, and a good bread giver. Sometimes a guild speaks in one voice. Sometimes a group of neighbors, or even a tavern, declares a preference. The duo Viri who built the amphitheater returned to the ballot in later years as patrons and arbiters. Old Campanian names do not vanish from these notices, which tells us that the colony did not turn its back on the local elite. Rather, The new constitution draws the ambitious from both groups into a competition with Roman rules and Campanian intensity. There is tension in any forced refounding. The legal fiction of a clean slate never entirely covers the bruises of confiscation. Graffiti from later decades carry insults that remember who was an outsider and who was once an enemy. Yet the colony's daily life grows its own cohesion. Children of colonists and locals learn Latin in the same schools and take their places at the same games. Guilds bring craftsmen together in practices that ignore old loyalties and reward skill. Priests of the civic cults preside over rituals that promise prosperity for everyone who stands in the crowd. Markets, marriages, and municipal spectacles do the slow work that policy can only begin. By the end of the 1st century before the Common Era the experiment has taken, Pompeii thinks of itself as a Roman city. Its calendar is Roman. Its magistrates are Roman. Its temple to Venus binds it to a Roman story of victory and favor. The old Oscan voice can still be heard in jokes in the taverns and in the wisdom of grandmothers, but the language of ambition is Latin. The physical city bears this out. From the forum to the gates and from the amphitheater to the river, the colony's stones show a confidence that expects the next generation to build higher, paint brighter, and celebrate more loudly. The larger world will soon reward this confidence with a long peace under new masters, and the money and fashion that flow from an empire at rest will dress Pompeii in a style even grander than the colony's founders imagined. For now, it is enough to stand in the amphitheater on a bright afternoon and listen to the noise of a city that has learned to cheer as one. The veterans who won the right to settle here have given Pompeii new institutions and new monuments. The families who preceded them have supplied the rootedness that makes a city more than an address. Together they have created a Roman Pompeii, whose voice will carry clearly into the age of Augustus and beyond. The empire arrived not as a trumpet blast, but as a change in temperature. After the violence and refounding of the late Republic, Pompeii entered the age of Augustus, with its institutions set and its ambitions tuned to a wider stage. The lava ridge above the Sarno now carried a colony that spoke in Latin formulas, elected magistrates by annual vote, kept careful accounts on bronze tablets, and understood how to turn spectacle, trade, and piety into capital. The first emperor did not need to conquer Pompeii. He needed only to offer the thing that a commercial town values most. He offered peace. Peace in Campania was not an abstraction. It could be measured in stone and water. Under Augustus, the long aqueduct from the Serino Springs, which Romans called the Aqua Augusta, stretched its arches and channels across the mountains and brought living water to the bay. Pompeii tapped that artery at the city's northern edge. The Castellum Aquae still stands there with its 3 calibrated outlets, a stone meter that divided the flow to fountains, baths, and private houses. Bronze stopcocks and lead fistulae carry the story downhill from that tower to more than 40 public basins and to the pipes that fed luxurious homes. Children could drink at corners shaded by fig trees. Bath attendants could count on a steady head of water to fill hot and cold rooms. Bakers could wash troughs, and millers could sluice stone floors at the end of a dusty day. When an ancient town acquires pressure and plumbing, its citizens acquire a different sense of time. Work becomes more regular. Cleanliness is easier. The city hums. That hum gathers in the Forum. It had been a market square and a civic set for centuries, but the Augustan age taught Pompeii the Roman grammar of monument. On the north side, the Temple of Jupiter, which had already claimed the skyline in late Republican form, received refinements that made its steps and podium fit for imperial ceremonies. Along the long sides of the square, new colonnades standardized the frame so that announcements and lawsuits would have a dignified backdrop. The basilica at the southwest corner served as courthouse and exchange. its nave and side aisles accommodating both advocates and lenders. Opposite the basilica rose a building with a different logic. The Macellum was a market hall where meat, fish, and the best produce of the Sarno farms were sold beneath a proper roof. Its central tholos offered shade over scales and stalls. Ice was unknown, but shaded counters and swift hands made freshness a virtue of punctuality. People learned to buy early. No building better expresses the entanglement of civic pride, commercial muscle, and imperial ideology than the Eumachia building on the east side of the Forum. It is a vast porticoed hall with a grand marble facade and an inscription that names a woman as its benefactor. Eumachia, daughter of Lucius, priestess of Venus, financed the building in honor of Concordia, Augusta, and Pietas. She was not ornamenting the city from idleness. She and her family were entangled with the fullers and dyers who washed, stretched, and finished cloth for the Campanian market. The doorway to the building bears a relief of wool working. Guilds met here, and men conducted business beneath statues of the imperial household. A priestess and a trade spoke together in the language that Augustus taught the empire. Piety to the gods and loyalty to the imperial family are not distractions from commerce. They are the conditions for its flourishing. A few paces away, another shrine framed the new political religion with Campanian intimacy. The small temple of Fortuna Augusta occupied a slot on the street that led from the Forum toward the theatre district. It was founded by a prominent citizen named Marcus Tullius, not the orator of Rome, but a local notable who knew exactly how to harmonize the city's old devotions with the new cult of imperial luck. In its courtyard stood statues that proclaimed the virtues of the ruling house. In its ceremonies, the Decurions and the Augustales, who were priests of the imperial cult often drawn from the ranks of successful freedmen, performed the rites that bound Pompeii to Rome with garlands and wine. The Augustan climate can also be heard in the city's entertainment quarter. The large open-air theatre that had been carved into the southern slope during the late Republic was remodeled with a more ambitious stage building and with seating and ornament that suited patrons who wanted their benefactions to be unmistakable. The Odeon, a smaller covered theatre to the west, provided a hall where voices could fill the air without wind or glare. Families like the Holconii paid for renovations that set their names in stone along stairways and balustrades. The amphitheatre at the eastern edge of town, a Republican gift, took on a new life under early empire. Games were costlier to mount and more regular. Procurers brought in animals and fighters from farther afield. The graffiti that Pompeians scratched on plaster walls read like the sports pages of a town that had learned to entertain itself in public. If the Forum and theatres were the city's public face, the baths were its public heart. The Stabian baths, among the oldest in Italy, were modernized with improved heating systems and with the classical sequence that made Roman bathing a kind of social choreography. A patron could leave his sandals at the threshold and pass through a temperate room to a hot room, then plunge into a cold pool before drifting into the palestra to exercise or gossip. The Forum baths near the Civic Square offered a more centrally located alternative. Later, along the slope toward the sea, the suburban baths would open with handsome sea-facing rooms whose walls absorbed the latest fashion in painting. Pompeii shows what the Roman world achieved in the art of daily comfort. It institutionalized cleanliness and conversation. The domestic sphere thrived in parallel. Wall painting styles evolved as a visible calendar of taste. What scholars call the second style, with its painted architecture and illusion of depth, had already turned houses into theaters for the eye in the last Republican decades. Under Augustus, a new taste came into play. The third style favored delicate panels that floated on rich monochrome fields and turned away from imagined vistas to framed pictures and fine linear ornament. Rooms became galleries, where small mythological scenes were treated like cameos. The fashion is best understood as a claim to cosmopolitan discernment. A man with a dining room painted in the latest mode signaled his place in an empire of taste. In later years, under the successors of Augustus, a fourth style would emerge that combined spatial illusion and decorative fantasy with exuberant confidence. For now, the third style ruled dinner parties. Prosperity did not limit itself to the city proper. The countryside around Pompeii sprouted villas that combined agriculture and pleasure. Farm managers pressed grapes in long rooms lined with dolia. The great earthenware jars sunk to their shoulders in the floor. Oil presses groaned when the olives came in. The jars were sealed with pitch and chalked with names and dates. The Sarno carried the products down to the landing places and from there to Puteoli and beyond. Amphore forms tell the story, with a precision that few ancient industries can match. Dressel numbers are the taxonomy of success. Pompeian wine traveled in vessels that a merchant in Gaul or Spain would recognize at a glance. Labels painted on jar shoulders announced the producer, and sometimes the quality with a pride that could border on boast. Fish sauce also made the town's name abroad. A prominent producer, Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, left mosaics in his house that pictured amphorae of his garum as an emblem of triumph. He exported flavor in clay, and the empire developed a taste for it. Inside the walls, work was constant and visible. Bakers set up full-scale operations with teams of donkeys turning millstones day and night, and with ovens whose blackened arches still tell of thousands of loaves baked and sold. Fullers ran their vats near the forum, washing and finishing cloth with water, clay, and the sharp tang of ammonia from jars that collected urine at street corners. Thermopylae, the fast food counters of the Roman world, lined busy streets with jars set into masonry bars. There, a worker could buy hot stew and wine before returning to a shop that left little time for a home-cooked meal. Ironmongers repaired plowshares and chisels and made fittings that gave doors and chests their gentle click. If one walks the long spine of the city from the Porta Marina up to the Porta Vesuvio, the rhythm of shops and houses suggests a population on the order of 10 to 12,000 residents within the walls, with many more flowing in from the farms and nearby towns on market days. Money and credit lubricated this machine. Evidence from a villa suburbana along the Sarno, where a cache of tablets belonging to the Sulpicii was found, gives a window onto mid-1st century lending that served the needs of shipping and landholding alike. Contracts were written for loans secured by cargoes and by property, with interest rates that reflected risk and season. Pompeii and its hinterland were not a barter economy dressed in stone. They were a cash society embedded in a web of credit that reached Puteoli, Naples, and Rome. A baker could mortgage a shop front. A vintner could secure a loan against the vintage that was still ripening on the slopes. A shipper could pledge amphorae already loaded on a barge at the Sarno mouth. Politics in this climate remained intensely local and yet always mindful of Rome. The Ordo of Decurions sat in their council and governed with an eye on the goodwill of the emperor and the governor of the province. Duaviri campaigned with painted notices that filled the end walls of streets. Voters were asked to choose men who were honest, modest, and good bread givers. The phrase is precise. Aediles oversaw the grain supply and public order. They were expected to fund games and largesse from their own pockets as a prelude to higher office. Freedmen rose within this system through wealth and through membership in the colleges of Augustales. These priests of the imperial cult oversaw festivals that turned political loyalty into public joy. The social ladder was not a fiction. It stood in the forum and in the neighborhoods as a structure that connected slaves who might one day be freed, freedmen who might one day sponsor games, and citizens whose sons would aspire to the council. Religion threaded itself through every layer of this life. The old sanctuaries to Apollo and to Jupiter received repairs and new statuary. The Temple of Venus above the western gate linked the city to its founder and to the sea. Household shrines in Atria honored the Lares and the genius of the paterfamilias with garlands and offerings of wine and grain. The imperial cult folded itself into this rhythm, adding processions in which magistrates led the people through streets hung with wreaths while incense wafted from altars and choir boys learned hymns that named the emperor as guardian of prosperity. Foreign cults sat comfortably in this religious crowd. The sanctuary of Isis near the theatre district offered music and ritual that had traveled from Egypt through the Hellenistic world to Campania, where traders and sailors found its blend of mystery and promise attractive. The presence of that temple before the mid-century earthquake tells us that Pompeii was open to piety that came by sea. Urban form followed function. Once the frontier of a troubled republic, the city walls no longer needed to be a constant line of arms. Towers became places to view gardens and to enjoy breezes. Sections of the wall were integrated with houses that leaned against the old stones. Gates were rebuilt with finer masonry and with ramps that made the passage of carts less jarring. Streets were paved more thoroughly, and stepping stones were placed more liberally, so that citizens in white could cross when the gutters ran after a summer storm. Even the signage of the city grew more refined. Painted programmatic panels on house fronts announced bakeries, wine shops, and workshops. Phallic symbols on facades and paving stones advertised luck, fertility, and protection with a blunt humor that everyone understood. The result of all these threads is a portrait of a city that understood its moment. Under Augustus and his early successors, Pompeii was not a marginal town on the edge of a glamorous bay. It was a functioning node in the imperial system and an inventive community that used that system to grow. It took water from a mountain, ran it through bronze and lead to every corner, and turned it into bread, baths, and fountains. It took taste from Rome and Alexandria and Athens and translated it into painted rooms and theatre programs. It took law from the capital and applied it in a council house where contracts were read and judgments given. It took piety from old Latin temples and new imperial cults and arranged both on a calendar that taught continuity. Its citizens became a people who believed that tomorrow's markets would open on time. There were tremors beneath this calm. The mountain that fed the vineyards was not dead. Politics in Rome would lurch as emperors came and went. Crowds could turn violent when pride and wine mixed on a festival day. But those are stories for the next act. The Augustan Pompeii that we see most clearly is a city that earned its prosperity by desiring order and by practicing it. If one wants to understand why the world would later weep at its loss, one must first see how fully it belonged to the living empire around it, and how joyfully it made that empire its own. Prosperity is a delicate fabric. It is woven from confidence and routine, and it can fray quickly when pride or nature pulls at the threads. In Pompeii, the first pull came not from the mountain but from men. In the year that later chroniclers recorded as the consulship of Nero and Piso, the gladiatorial games were in full cry at the amphitheater on the eastern edge of town. The structure was barely a generation old and already a point of civic pride. A monument where colonists and old Campanian families sat in the same sun and cheered as one city. On that day, visitors from Nuceria came to watch the contests. They brought with them the ordinary rivalry that travels with a town's name. Catcalls flew across the tiers. The words turned sharper. Stones followed the words. Soon the rivalries of neighboring cities were being fought with clubs in the stairways and with knives along the arcades beneath the seats. People ran for the exits. Others took the fight into the field outside, where vendors had set up stalls and boys had turned sticks into toy spears. The historian Tacitus, who is our main voice for this episode, tells the rest with the cool anger of a Roman senator. He names a sponsor of the games, a certain Livius Regulus, whose reputation was already stained in the capital. He describes the wounded from Nuceria returning to their city with empty sleeves, and fathers seeking sons who did not come home. When the inquiry reached Rome, the Senate acted with the full weight of its authority. The games in Pompeii were banned for 10 years. The amphitheater was closed. The principal organizers were exiled. It was a punishment meant to sting and to teach, and it came down not merely on individuals, but upon the civic body that had allowed a festival to become a pitched battle. On a plaster wall in a modest house near the Stabian Gate, a painter left us a view of the scene that is as valuable as any historian's paragraph. It is a fresco of the amphitheater, with its awnings stretched like sails and the crowd in agitation. Outside the oval you see the canvas booths of merchants and the beginning of chaos as men grapple in the dust. The painter was not concerned with political philosophy. He was recording an event that shook the town and that people still talked about when they bought bread in the morning. This image is as close as we can come to standing in the field while the shouts rose and turned ugly. The punishment changed the rhythm of civic life. An amphitheater is more than a venue. It is a calendar. With the ban in place, the city lost a regular gathering in which patrons could parade their generosity and guilds could show their banners. For a decade, there were no official games. That loss pressed other venues into heavier use. The theaters near the Triangular Forum carried more of the public burden, and private banquets and neighborhood festivals had to absorb the energy that games once directed. The graffiti that advertised fighters and taunt rival towns thin out in the years after the ban. The city learned a lesson about pride and spectacle that would sit uneasily with its appetite for a good show. No civic censure, however, can police the ground under a city. In the early months of the year 62, an earthquake tore through Campania. The philosopher and courtier Seneca, writing about natural phenomena, gives a sober account of the violence. The shock struck without warning. Buildings in Pompeii, Herculaneum, and along the coast buckled and fell. Roofs crashed inward. Statues toppled from pedestals. Water in fountains heaved in bowls, as if a giant hand had shaken the city by the shoulders. The long aqueduct that carried the lifeblood of the region cracked in places. People ran into the streets and then found that the streets were no safer than the rooms they had fled. Pompeii's fabric was tested along every seam. In the Forum, colonnades snapped and left drums of stone scattered among the paving blocks. The Temple of Jupiter, which anchored the northern end of the square, lost parts of its superstructure. The law courts and the market hall took damage that would require not just patching, but reconsideration. The Stabian Baths, pride of a city that could measure its civility by the quality of its bathing, suffered breaks in their pipes and cracks in their vaults. The theaters saw their stairways fractured. In neighborhoods far from the Forum, the damage followed no easy rule. A grand house with strong walls might stand with only plaster shaken from its painted panels, while a modest shop 2 doors away collapsed into its own cellar. The swiftest record of the earthquake is the archaeology of repair. Within months, perhaps within weeks, teams of builders were shoring up walls with timber braces and reusing whatever stone could be salvaged. The ruins of older monuments were quarried for ready-dressed blocks. Spolia appears everywhere in the layers that follow. Blocks with old moldings are turned face inward to serve as plain wall. Columns that once marched around a courtyard are cut and used as cornerstones in a new facade. In some places, brick is mixed with tufa in a checker of convenience. Where the old tradition had demanded uniform courses of local stone, the post-earthquake city begins to tolerate a patchwork that is as eloquent as any inscription. It tells of urgency and of a people unwilling to wait for perfection while roofs gaped to the sky. Religion led the way, as it often does after disaster. Near the theatre district, the Temple of Isis rose from the rubble with new vigor. An inscription records that a child, Numerius Popidius Celsinus, rebuilt the sanctuary with his family's funds, and that the city rewarded him with admission to the council. Even though he had not yet reached the required age, the words fix more than a date. They fix a social fact. Freedmen and their children, who thrived in the commerce of this port town, could transform wealth into honor through public benefaction. The Isis temple is not just a place of Egyptian rite in a Campanian city. It is a monument to social mobility that the earthquake made possible by presenting a need and an opportunity at the same time. Elsewhere, the work advanced in stages. The Forum saw continuous scaffolding as colonnades were rebuilt and pedestals reset. Shops were reopened behind propped facades, while masons chipped away on the upper courses. The Macellum gained a small shrine to the imperial household, a gesture that harmonized loyalty with the daily purchase of fish and meat. The aqueduct repairs prioritized public fountains and baths before private houses. The Castellum Aquae at the northern edge of the city shows modifications in this period that suggest a careful recalibration of flow. If the water can run in the street basins, the city's heart can continue to beat. Wall painting offers a silent chronicle of recovery. Many houses that had displayed the delicate panels of the third style before the earthquake received a new round of decoration in the years after '62. The painters embraced a more exuberant mode. Large architectural fantasies with theatrical perspectives appeared, and with them a new taste for rich color blocks cut by airy columns and framed vistas. Scholars call this movement the fourth style. It is not just an aesthetic fashion, it is a timestamp. It tells us that patrons spent good money to restore beauty to rooms that had been shaken and scarred. Dining rooms were refreshed so that clients and friends could be received without the embarrassment of cracked plaster and faded myth. Atriums glittered again where water had poured through broken roofs on the first fearful day. Industry recovered as well. Bakers repaired their mills and brought donkeys back to their circuits. The sound of the bakery is the sound of a city breathing again after a blow. Fullers set their vats to work with a ferocity that suggests not only routine business, but a spike in demand as households sent damaged garments for cleaning and repair. Workshops along the major streets displayed new thresholds with reused stone uprights. Many of them added subfloors to lighten loads on compromised foundations. In the suburban baths along the slope toward the sea, restoration produced some of the most elegant rooms in the city, with paintings and stucco that embrace the new fashion. The choice to invest in baths while temples and civic buildings were still under repair says much about priorities. Cleanliness, sociability, and the daily ritual of the bath were not luxuries in Roman life. They were the proof of normalcy. The political class moved quickly to associate itself with recovery. Electoral notices painted along street fronts in the 60 seconds appeal to voters with promises of generosity and reliability. Some candidates identify themselves directly with construction projects. The council minutes do not survive, but the stones record votes of thanks to benefactors who supervised the rebuilding of porticos and the repair of paving. There is every reason to believe that imperial authorities took an interest as well. Nero visited Campania more than once during his reign and favored Naples with performances that courtiers remembered for their novelty and audacity. Whether he stood among the scaffolding in Pompeii is not recorded, but the empire's administrative machine knew how to route resources and craftsmen toward a stricken region when the reputation of Roman order required it. The years after the earthquake were marked by aftershocks that reminded residents that the ground had not returned to its old obedience. Smaller quivers rattled doors and sent people into courtyards until the tremors passed. The old city wall, once an instrument of defense, took on a new role as a buttress for houses that leaned upon it. In several stretches, the inner faces of the wall were integrated with domestic architecture in a way that suggests a deliberate use of the ancient masonry to stiffen new work. This was practical engineering in an uncertain world. The ban on games had its term, and after it expired, the amphitheater reopened to cheers. The painting of the riot continued to hang in its modest house, a domestic reminder of what can happen when civic pride outruns civic responsibility. The return of games did not erase the memory of the Senate's rebuke. If anything, it sharpened the city's appetite for order. Stewards and lictors were more visible at public entertainments. Seating arrangements were enforced more carefully. The same passion that had once driven men to fight under the awnings now drove patrons to fund safer passages and sturdier barriers. Spectacle survived, but it did so under a sterner discipline. By the late 60s, the city had made remarkable progress. The Forum regained its coherence. Theaters were in use. Baths steamed again each evening. Villas in the countryside produced vintages that merchants at Puteoli were happy to move. Yet the scars of '62 were still visible in '79 when the mountain finally spoke in fire. Column drums in the Forum were not yet fully returned. A number of grand houses show rooms mid-decoration, with pots of pigment left ready for painters who never return to finish their work. Temporary walls built as emergency measures remained in place, where permanent repairs had been postponed, or where funds had run thin. It is one of the bittersweet truths of Pompeii's preservation that we can see this unfinished work with such clarity. The disaster that buried the city froze both its achievements and its plans. Out of these years, there emerges a portrait of resilience that is as instructive as any triumphal inscription. A community that had been punished by the Senate for a violent outbreak learned to manage its pride. A city that had been shaken to pieces by an earthquake learned to rebuild almost everything that matters. It did so by improvisation and by adherence to forms. It reused stones with a pragmatism that would have scandalized earlier masons but pleased any practical builder. It honored the gods with renewed temples. It brought water back to its fountains. It repainted its rooms in the latest style because beauty is not a frivolity when a household wants to feel whole again. It returned to the bath and to the theater and eventually to the games because public joy is the refuge of a battered place. If we wish to take the measure of Pompeii before the final catastrophe, we must understand these years of crisis and recovery. They reveal a people capable of self-discipline after disgrace and of collective effort after disaster. That is the city we see on the eve of the eruption. Its stones hold the memory of a riot and the scars of a quake, and yet its streets are busy and its calendar full. Begin at daybreak in the Forum when the paving stones still hold the cool of the night. The square is a long rectangle framed by porticos and public buildings, a deliberate stage for the rituals of civic life. Farmers from the Sarno plain arrive first with baskets tied across the backs of donkeys. Then shopkeepers push shutters up and sweep thresholds. Then the clerks of the magistrates take their posts beneath the eaves of the basilica. Everything has a place and an hour. Public life in Pompeii was a choreography learned over generations, and its steps can still be read in stone. The Forum concentrated the essential functions of the city. On the north end, the great podium of Jupiter defined authority, a temple whose steps looked down upon the square and whose altar gathered sacrifices on days when the council and the people prayed for prosperity. Along the west edge, the basilica stretched in a measured hall with a nave and aisles where advocates spoke, bankers met clients, and contracts changed hands under the eyes of magistrates. The south and east flanks carried porticos behind which lay offices and storerooms, and in some cases, honorary rooms for priestly colleges, or for guilds that paid rent and gained prestige from their address. Small statues stood on inscribed bases at the corners of the square, reminders that the city honored those who spent freely for its benefit. The logic was simple and public. If you wished to be remembered, you invested in the life of the forum. Near the northeast corner, the Macellum translated that logic into the ordinary business of appetite. It was a covered market with a ring of tabernae and a central tholos where inspectors weighed meat and fish. Marble counters bear the grooves of knives and the shallow cups where scales were balanced. The stalls opened early because freshness was a race against the Campanian Sunday. Fishmongers brought eels and small tunny from the bay at dawn. Butchers displayed cuts from local herds fattened on valley pastures. Fruit sellers arranged figs, pears, and late grapes in pyramids that could tempt a careful housekeeper to spend an extra coin. The Macellum was also a school of trust. Weights and measures were checked against official standards kept by the aediles, and a heavy hand on the scale was a quick path to a fine. Water made the forum a place of relief as well as transaction. Fountains stood at the corners and in adjacent streets, fed by the Castellum Aquae on the northern height. Bronze spouts poured into stone basins crowned by posts where people could rest a jug while it filled. The distribution pipes that lay beneath the pavement had been calibrated by engineers who understood pressure and priority. Public fountains and baths had the first call. Only after those needs were met did water run to the houses of the wealthy. This priority is visible in the number and placement of basins. Even the poorest quarters were within a short walk of a source. Children learned to carry amphorae without spilling, and to wait their turn when a queue formed on a hot afternoon. Streets around the forum were the city's arteries. They were paved in heavy stone blocks whose ruts still record centuries of carts. Stepping stones set at intervals allowed pedestrians to cross when gutters ran after cleaning or rain. Curbs were high and often rounded at the corners, so that iron-edged wheels did not bite them to pieces. Bollards narrowed the mouths of certain lanes to keep heavy wagons from cutting through at speed. Traffic rules were more custom than statute, but a visitor could see patterns. Carts carried loads inward in the early morning and outward in the late afternoon. Shopkeepers stacked amphorae on the threshold until porters could shoulder them inside. The soundscape was steady and practical. Iron tires on stone, the drone of millstones from bakeries, sellers calling prices, a hammer from a workshop where a hinge or clasp was being repaired. Commerce flourished in hundreds of small premises. A taberna was a shallow unit with a wide opening onto the street and often a back room for storage or sleep. Wine shops presented jars sunk into counters and ladled measures into cups. Thermopolia kept stews warm and sold portions to laborers who did not return home at midday. Cobblers sat on stools and fitted sandals while customers stood on the threshold. Joiners carved chair legs and polished small boxes from olive or maple. Along the lanes that led to the amphitheater, vendors who catered to game days stacked cheap snacks and clay cups on shelves, prepared to serve crowds that could triple the ordinary foot traffic. In the theater district, sellers made a living from walnuts, pork sausages, and cushions that a tired playgoer could rent for a few coins. The city understood how to turn pleasure into income. Public service and public order were the duty of magistrates and their assistants. The duoviri presided over courts and chaired the council. The aediles maintained streets, fountains, markets, and waits. Lictors enforced summonses and kept a semblance of peace in crowded places. The council, the Ordo Decurionum, met in a curia near the Forum and deliberated on contracts, repairs, and honors. Records of their decrees survive in inscriptions that thank benefactors for building stairways, repairing porticos, or underwriting festivals. Freedmen could not sit in the council, but they could gain prestige and a path to influence by joining priestly colleges like the Augustales and by financing entertainments that made their names familiar to the crowd. Electoral notices painted on stucco surfaces show how energetic this politics of reputation could be. Whole blocks of walls are covered with endorsements that urge support for a candidate described as upright, modest, a good bread giver, a reliable guardian of public order. Neighbors, guilds, and even tavern groups speak with one voice. The paint is both routine and intimate. It was applied at night by professional advertisers who knew where a message would meet the most eyes the next day. Religion framed the calendar of public life. The Forum hosted processions that wound from temple to temple, with magistrates in white and youths carrying incense and hymns rising above the tramp of sandaled feet. The Temple of Jupiter presided over state sacrifices. The Temple of Venus on the western height welcomed sailors and merchants who vowed offerings for safe landfall. The Sanctuary of Apollo along the Forum's west side cued worshippers who combined ancient Italic devotion with Greek ritual. In the theatre quarter, the Temple of Isis drew a different crowd with music and rites that had traveled from Egypt through the Greek world to Campania. Civic religion and imported cults did not compete so much as harmonize. Each offered a way to bind people to the city and to one another. Public vows accompanied by banquets were instruments of social cohesion as effective as any law. The institutions of entertainment filled the other half of the civic week. The large theatre seated thousands in a fan carved into the southern slope and provided comedy and musical shows in the season. A smaller roofed theatre nearby hosted recitations, concerts, and civic ceremonies. Donors like the Holconii and the Attilii funded improvements that fixed their names on stairways and parapets. To the east, beyond the town wall, the amphitheatre stood ready for spectacles that mixed courage, ritual, and public appetite. Gladiatorial schools brought trained fighters. Wild beast hunts displayed animals that most citizens would never see in the wild. It was noisy and sometimes unruly, and it was also a school in which the city learned the disciplines of an ordered crowd. After the riot of '59 and the Senate's ban, stewards and magistrates increased their vigilance. When the ban expired and games returned, patrons invested in safer circulation and barriers. The arena became again what its builders intended, a spectacle that reconciled civic pride with common joy. Hygiene and sociability met in the bathhouses. The Stabian baths served the southern neighborhoods with a suite of rooms arranged around a palestra. The Forum baths offered a central option for the busy. The suburban baths, terraced above the seaside road, provided elegant rooms where light and fresco combined with heat and cold to produce an experience that was both restorative and social. Entry fees were modest and sometimes remitted by sponsors on festival days. The sequence of rooms taught habit: tepidarium to warm the body, caldarium to sweat and cleanse, frigidarium to brace, then back to the palestra for oil and strigil and talk. News and rumor moved through these spaces as quickly as steam. A city that bathes together twice a day is a city that circulates information with unusual speed. One should not miss the small techniques that made dense public life possible. Public latrines near the Forum and in the baths used running water beneath bench seats and had basins at the entrance for rinsing sponges. Street cleaners were hired to scrape refuse toward gutters and out through the gates where waste could be spread on fields or dumped in pits. Urine jars placed at corners collected the raw material for the fullers, who paid to gather it and turned it into a cleaning agent for cloth. Fire risks were reduced by daylight bans on open braziers in certain districts and by the habit of cooking in shops rather than in cramped upper rooms. In hot months, awnings were slung across stretches of the forum and over seats in the amphitheater to make gatherings bearable. Shop signs, painted or carved above doorways, advertised trades with symbols that spoke to the illiterate. A denarius and a handshake could settle more matters than any scroll. Graffiti are the most personal register of this public world. Thousands survive scratched into plaster. Some are electoral endorsements, some are jokes. Some are boasts by lovers who wanted a wall to remember them. A passerby in a lane near the forum might read a line that praises a baker's bread or an actor's skill or a favorite gladiator's victories. A shopkeeper might leave a record of a loan or a delivery on a column beside his counter, confident that the note would be understood and perhaps even respected until he came back with a brush to write it larger. These marks are the small change of communication in a city that relied on voices and eyes rather than parchment and seals. Civic memory fixed itself in routes as much as in monuments. Processions followed the same paths on festival days. Guilds met on the same benches, under the same porticos. Voters walked to the same side streets at election time, where scribes waited with tallies and magistrates with tablets. Children learned to step on the same stones when they crossed a busy lane. A town that repeats these movements for generations builds a sense of belonging that no speech can rival. The stones of Pompeii taught citizenship by use. At noon, the forum thins. Shadows shrink beneath the colonnades. Clerks roll up documents and go to the baths. Shopkeepers shut half shutters and eat in the cool of back rooms. The square grows quiet, except for the steady trickle at the fountains and the murmur from the Macellum, where late buyers haggle over what remains on the slabs. By late afternoon, the lanes fill again, this time with carts headed outward and with children tumbling toward the palaestra to watch older boys wrestle. At dusk, lamps bloom along shop fronts and under arches. The city does not sleep early. There are banquets to attend and taverns to visit and music from the theaters on festival nights. The forum in the last light has the calm of a place that knows it has earned its rest. Public life in Pompeii was not an abstraction of marble and law. It was the sum of 1,000 practiced acts. Drawing water at the corner basin, voting for a neighbor whose generosity was known, buying figs under the roof of a market that smelled of salt and stone, praying at a podium where the gods had watched generations pass, laughing and grieving together in venues where the city took its own measure. These routines made a civic body that could endure punishments and earthquakes, and yet return each morning to open the shutters and sweep the steps. Open a street door in Pompeii, and you enter a world arranged for display, duty, and devotion. The ordinary house faced the roadway with a modest facade that gave little away. Inside, space opened in stages. A narrow passage guided the visitor into the atrium, the central room open to the sky where rain fell through a square opening and collected in a shallow basin. Light struck water and rippled up painted walls. Family portraits or bronze statuettes stood at the far end. The layout rehearsed a social ritual that every household understood. Clients came at dawn to pay respects to the master of the house. Petitioners waited in the cool shade beneath the roof beams. Children watched servants cross the polished thresholds, carrying baskets of fruit, oil, and bread. The house taught hierarchy and hospitality with its plan alone. Roman Pompeii filled these rooms with an art that made argument for culture in color and stone. Mosaic floors ranged from simple black and white patterns to expensive panels that required a master's hand. The most famous in the city, the battle scene from the House of the Faun, arranged tens of thousands of tiles to show a desperate struggle between kings and conquerors. Elsewhere, humbler homes placed small emblems at the entry, sometimes a theatrical mask, sometimes a fish or a vine, and sometimes a warning written in tesserae that a modern eye cannot pass without a smile. "Beware of the dog," the floor announced, while a lean hound strained on a chain. The house spoke before its owner did. Wall painting carried the argument further. In the late Republic, the favored fashion was what scholars call the second style, a theatrical trick of painted architecture that pushed walls outward into imagined colonnades and distant gardens. Under Augustus, a new taste came into vogue. Painters framed small scenes on monochrome fields, suspended delicate panels, and set fine lines like jewelry on deep red or black or yellow grounds. This third style cultivated restraint and elegance. In the years after the earthquake of 62, a more exuberant manner took hold. The fourth style mixed illusion and ornament, set up stage flats and airy columns, and filled rooms with bright vistas and mythological episodes that rewarded a lingering eye. You can walk from house to house and read fashions as if turning the pages of a family album. One house in particular shows what new money wished to say. The house of the Vetti belonged to two freedmen who had made fortunes in trade. They poured that wealth into a residence that choreographed awe. At the entrance, a painted figure of Priapus weighed prosperity on a scale and promised plenty. The atrium was refreshed with a gleaming marble table and bronze statuettes. Beyond it, the peristyle garden became a theater of water and shade. Fountains threw jets into basins. Garden beds were trimmed with box and myrtle. Copies of famous Greek statues stood among the shrubs. In the dining rooms, the walls told dangerous stories. Pentheus torn by the maddened women of Dionysus. Ixion bound to a wheel. Cupids working as vintners and goldsmiths in playful friezes that hinted at commerce turned to pleasure. Nothing here was careless. A visitor left the house with a lesson in aspiration and a conviction that the city's freedmen knew how to live as citizens. Domestic space was also a workshop of religion. At the edge of the atrium, or within the garden court, stood the Lararium, a household shrine that is among the most frequent sights in Pompeii. A painted niche, or a small altar housed figures of the family's guardian spirits and the genius of the head of household. Coiling snakes, symbols of fertility and protection, approached offerings set on a step. The family made small sacrifices of wine and incense here, a wreath at the new year, a prayer before a journey, a pledge redeemed on safe return. The images are everywhere, and they speak with the same calm voice. The divine lives with the family and watches the doorway. Religion tied the home to the street. At the neighborhood crossroads stood shrines to the lares of the district. Augustus, eager to bind domestic and imperial piety, had linked these local spirits with the fortunes of the ruling house. In Pompeii, the collegia of Augustales, often led by prosperous freedmen, tended these altars and organized processions in which the neighborhood became a congregation. On festival days, the doors of houses were dressed with greenery. Children carried baskets of flowers. Magistrates and priests in white tunics walked through streets where awnings gave shade and music kept time. A city cannot live by taxes and laws alone. It also needs a calendar of sacred obligations that teach people to stand together. The kitchen and pantry complete the domestic picture. Many houses had compact cooking spaces with a masonry hearth and a small oven, large pots blackened by years of use, and jars sunk in counters to hold grain, oil, or dried fruit. Bronze kettles and frying pans hung from hooks. Terracotta lamps with a single wick lit the work. In some homes, carbonized remains have preserved a moment never meant to be seen. Loaves scored for baking lay in ovens. A chest of silver waited on a shelf. A ring of keys still pressed into a handful of ash. These details are not voyeurism. They are the material of daily life, the small instruments by which a family fed itself and marked its place in the world. The Pompeian house had a second life as a place of business. Shop fronts opened onto the street from the same building that held an elegant atrium and peristyle. A wine bar might occupy the corner while the owner's family lived a few rooms away. A baker turned millstones with the steady help of donkeys in a busy rear court, while his children learned their letters from a hired tutor in the atrium. A fuller with troughs for cloth and jars of strong-smelling ammonia might rent space beside a fine house and pay part of the rent in services. The city mixed classes and trades with a freedom that puts modern zoning to shame. The plan of the house encouraged it. The rooms nearest the sidewalk served commerce and clients. The rooms beyond the court sheltered family and ceremony. Gardens were not ornaments alone. Archaeologists have replanted several peristyles using pollen and seed evidence collected from the ancient beds. The results give us hedges of myrtle and box, plane trees trained to provide shade, laurels and roses, lilies and violets, and the small trickle of water that turns heat into music. In some gardens, fish ponds held mullet or carp. In others, the scent of herbs drifted in from beds planted with savory plants for the kitchen. Wealthy households had gardeners who shaped topiary and kept fountains clear. But even modest homes managed a green space where birds fluttered among statues and sunlight shook on a small pool. The garden linked the home to the countryside and carried the memory of farms into the heart of the city. Beyond the walls, villas pushed domestic art and comfort to their limits. Along the roads to the sea and the river, suburban and rural estates combined production and pleasure. Press rooms with beam and screw turned grapes into wine and olives into oil. Storerooms lined with great jars held the year's harvest. Reception rooms framed long views to the bay and collected breezes in summer. The Bosca Real treasure, a cache of silver from a villa north of Pompeii, shows what table service looked like when a patron wished to impress guests with fine cups and bowls. The Villa of Mysteries, just outside the Herculaneum Gate, holds a painted cycle that has captivated generations. Its deep red walls carry life-size figures through a sequence that many believe shows women initiated into the rites of Dionysus. Musicians, attendants, a seated matron, a child with a book, and a figure who leaps in fear at a god in goatskin, all enact a drama that scholars continue to debate. Whatever its precise meaning, the room taught guests that the owners could afford the finest painters and were at ease with religion that promised rebirth of a different kind. Funerary practice tied domestic identity to the memory of the community. Outside the gates, along the roads that led into the countryside, tombs lined the verges in an architecture of remembrance. The necropolis near the Herculaneum Gate preserves benches where the living could sit during commemorative meals and inscriptions that announce the virtues of those within. Freedmen claim seats for their families with pride. Cult associations provide a place for members who lacked heirs to be remembered. Tomb forms range from small altar-shaped monuments to grand semicircular benches and tower-like structures with niches for urns. Parentalia, the annual period for honoring the dead, brought families together at these tombs with food and wine. The city learned citizenship from its dead as well as from its walls. Shops and houses wore symbols that mixed protection and humor with commerce. Images of the phallus appear on facades and in floor mosaics, not as vulgar jokes but as signs of luck and fertility. Medusa heads faced doorways to turn away the evil eye. Mercury, the god of trade, appears often in small bronze or painted form. Fortuna stands with her rudder and cornucopia in shops where chance and plenty were daily concerns. These images do not feel otherworldly. They feel domestic and practical, part of a grammar in which a figure on a wall could shape the confidence of a day. The city's famous brothel shows another side of this blend of art and function. The small rooms with stone beds and painted scenes above the doors were not hiding in a shadow world. They sat in the fabric of the city as one more service among many. Prices scratched into the plaster tell a plain story. So do the jokes and insults traded in graffiti by clients and workers. A moralist can find offense. A historian finds a candor that helps explain why religion in Pompeii was so deeply woven into daily routines. When a city accepts every appetite as part of its life, it needs a dense net of ritual and restraint to remind people of order and bonds. Domestic objects complete the portrait. Lamps with scenes of gods, animals, and lovers. Glass cups in shades of green and blue that caught the light of an afternoon. Bronze cooking pots hammered thin for quick heat. Portable shrines fitted with small doors that could be closed when work began and opened again at evening. Children's toys in wood and clay. Dice and gaming counters lost in the cracks of a floor. Tools with handles worn smooth by a craftsman's hand. These are not relics to be pitied. They are good things that did their jobs well. Pompeii's houses were not mere shelters. They were engines of social exchange and theaters of art. They trained clients and children in the grammar of hierarchy. They displayed taste and ambition to neighbors and rivals. They bound families to gods at altars that glowed with candle smoke. They stitched private life to public life with shop fronts that opened onto streets filled with news. When the mountain fell silent at night, lamps still burned before the Lararia, and voices murmured prayers that the gods would keep watch until morning. The city that emerges from these rooms is a community confident enough to invest in beauty and disciplined enough to braid religion through every task, from baking bread to bidding for office. The city that entered the reign of the Flavians had already proven its stubbornness. It had been punished for a riot, and it had been shaken to pieces by an earthquake. Yet each morning the shutters still lifted, the fountains still ran, and the mills still turned under the steady pull of donkeys. When Vespasian won the hard contest of 4 emperors in the year 69, Pompeii found itself living under an authority that prized order and repair. The new dynasty did not govern Campania with grand proclamations alone. Its attention arrived in stonecutters, wages, and in the supply of lime, in contracts for road work, and in the steady restoration of the water system that bound the towns of the bay together. Peace, once more, could be measured in masonry. After the earthquake of 62, the aqueduct that fed Pompeii and its neighbors had needed constant care. The Castellum Aquae on the northern height, a sober tower of stone into which the city could look and read its own health, shows the signs of recalibration made in the later 60s and early 70s. Engineers adjusted the outlets for fountains and baths, trimmed private lines where pressure could not be spared, and brought public basins back to reliable flow. When the water ran, other rhythms resumed. Bath furnaces were stoked at midday, and again in the cool of evening. Bakers sluiced their floors after the last loaves were drawn. Fullers hauled buckets to their vats and set to work on the countless garments that a busy city soils each day. The return of pressure was more than convenience. It was a declaration that the city would not live by buckets from wells. The Forum provides a ledger of these years. Colonnades that had cracked were rebuilt with mixed fabric. Old drums turned inward, and new work faced outward with careful stucco. The Temple of Jupiter on its northern podium regained much of its dignity, even if some columns remained stumps waiting for capitals that never came. The Basilica at the southwest corner resumed its functions as law court and exchange. The Macellum reopened fully, and a small shrine within it honored the imperial household with modest piety, while butchers stacked meat on marble slabs and fish sellers laid out eels and mackerel on beds of wet leaves. The Eumachia building once more housed business that the textile guilds favored, proof that the steady coin of commerce often follows hard upon disaster when hands are ready and markets are hungry. Civic entertainment also returned to regularity. The 10-year ban that the Senate had imposed after the riot in '59 expired at the turn of the decade. With it, the amphitheater reopened to the cheers of a people who had been forced to remember how thin the line is between pride and violence. The reopening did not erase caution. Stewards and magistrates watched the crowd with a tighter discipline. Patrons invested in stronger barriers and safer circulation. On festival days, the field outside again filled with canvas booths and small traders who lived on the difference between what a crowd would spend before a spectacle and what it could be persuaded to spend afterward. Theaters in the south of the city played their own part. Renovations in the stage building and seating reminded audiences that the generosity of local elites was a language everyone understood. The houses tell the story most intimately. In the years after '62 and under the Flavians, owners commissioned painters to cover their rooms with the extravagant fantasies that scholars call the fourth style. The House of the Veti is the most polished statement of that taste. Two brothers, both freedmen who had moved from the world of work into the ranks of the prosperous, filled their rooms with myth, framed their gardens with fountains and statuary, and set at the threshold an image of Priapus weighing a bag of coin against his own emblem, as if prosperity itself could be captured on a scale. Many houses, not just the grandest, show similar confidence. Dining rooms glitter with panels on red and black grounds, their small scenes of heroes and nymphs inset like jewels. Porticos look onto replanted beds of myrtle and box, where water patters from bronze spouts. The city chose to answer shaking ground with beauty. The countryside answered with produce. Vines ran up trained stakes on the lower slopes of the mountain and across the plain. Olive trees returned to steady bearing. Press rooms in villas outside the walls worked long days in harvest season. Great earthen jars sunk to their shoulders in the floors of storerooms kept wine and oil cool. Amphorae for export stood in ranks near the river landing, chalked with marks that named producer and vintage. Some bore the names of families already famous in Pompeii for their sauces and condiments. Merchants at Puteoli knew the weight and smell of these jars. Bargemen on the Sarno learned the creak they made when a load shifted under a change of current. Grain came down from inland farms as well, for even a fertile city waited on provinces for staples when the local harvest dipped. Credit linked these endeavors to the wider world. Contracts for loans secured by cargoes and properties survived in more than one household archive, and even where tablets are lost, the practice is plain. A vintner could borrow against a harvest in the field. A shipper could pledge amphorae on a barge for a short run to the bay. A builder could take a loan against future payments from a public contract to repair a colonnade. In such transactions, a city tested the strength of its institutions. Courts that could adjudicate a dispute swiftly, weights and measures that had the confidence of buyers, and magistrates who kept streets and fountains in good repair were not luxuries. They were the terms on which capital trusted a place. Religion provided meaning and discipline to this recovery. The Temple of Isis, rebuilt after the earthquake with funds from a family of freedmen and consecrated by the promotion of a boy to the city council as a reward for his family's generosity, stood near the theater district as a strong symbol that old boundaries in status could be crossed through public benefaction. The sanctuary drew sailors and merchants who had learned its liturgy in Alexandria and along the Levantine coast. At the Forum, the old sanctuaries regained their regular ritual life. The imperial cult, woven into civic ceremony since the age of Augustus, took on renewed intensity under Vespasian and Titus. Festivals for concord and for the fortuna of the ruling house framed loyalty in garlands and song. Priests of the Augustales, often men who had risen from slavery into wealth, had visible roles. They wore white and processed with the magistrates. Their names joined those of the old families on statue bases. piety in these years was a social solvent. Nothing in this restoration prevented Campanians from listening to Rome. News reached Pompeii through sailors at the port and through travelers on the coastal road that ran to Naples and on to the capital. People in the Forum could have traced the progress of the siege of Jerusalem and the triumph of Titus, and may even have seen exotic captives or animals bound for games pass through the district on their way to larger arenas. Coins struck with the legend of Judea, captured, made their way into purses and jars. The memory of civic disgrace in 59 and the open wound of 62 became part of a larger story in which the empire survived civil war and reasserted its claim to order with parades and arches and regular taxes. If these years feel calm on the surface, they also carry small warnings. Seneca had written after 62 that Campania should expect more trembling. He did not offer a theory of magma and vents. He offered the wisdom of observation, that a region which had seen a great shock would likely see a pattern of lesser ones. Pliny the Elder, whose appetite for marvels never blinded him to practical fact, wrote in his Natural History about the volcanic soils of the region and about the abrasives made from pumice, an item so common on the shores of the bay that it entered daily life as a tool for smoothing wood and softening skin. The very riches of the land came from a source that no Roman could see. They could only feel it. The final approach to the catastrophe is best understood from a Roman point of view. They did not name the geology of their land. They named their gods. They saw earthquakes as signs of divine displeasure and responded with vows and processions. When the ground stirred in that last week, they made their offerings and tightened their door frames and went about their business. On the evening before the end, a stronger tremor drove people from their beds into courtyards and streets. They kept lamps lit and spoke to neighbors while the ground settled. With dawn, they returned to kitchens and shops. The day began as every day begins in a city that believes in itself. This is the most poignant fact about Pompeii in the Flavian years. It had rebuilt, it had repainted, it had replanted, and it had resumed almost everything that gives meaning to urban life. It had folded freedmen into its honors, given young men theaters and arenas in which to show courage, restored temples that promised order and favor, and secured water that made cleanliness and comfort routine. It knew the earth shook now and then, and it had decided to live with that knowledge as farmers live with frost and sailors with squalls. The last decade is not a tale of dread. It is the record of a community that held its nerve and filled its days. The morning began as so many mornings had in that resilient decade. Bakers drew the first loaves, fullers swung paddles in their vats, and the fountains at the corners of the Forum whispered their steady reassurance. Sometime near midday, a column rose over the mountain. To a citizen standing in the Forum, it must have seemed like a pine tree thrust from the summit, a narrow trunk of ash and gas swelling into a broad crown, just as Pliny the Younger would later describe from the naval station at Misenum across the bay. Wind aloft blew from the north and west, shouldering the falling material toward Pompeii. The first stones were light and white, pumice as large as a fist. They rattled on terracotta tiles and bounced in the streets. Before long, grey stones followed, and fine ash came with them, and a steady hiss grew into a roar that never quite receded until it was too late to run. For centuries, readers took the ancient date of the catastrophe from the manuscripts of Pliny's letters, which give the day as the 9th before the calends of September, our August 24th. The Earth, however, keeps a second calendar. Archaeology inside the city has piled up autumn signs. Pomegranates and walnuts in storerooms, braziers set for the cool of evening, amphorae opened for a recently finished pressing of fish sauce, and a charcoal graffito in a house under repair dated to October 17th a quick note that could not have been written if the rooms had already been buried. Many scholars now favor a late October date. The precise day matters less than the layered picture that emerges. The year was in its last fruit, and the city that had rebuilt itself for 17 years after the earthquake of '62 was caught with scaffolding up, paint pots open, and plans unfinished. The eruption, which volcanologists now call Plinian for the witness who wrote of it, unfolded in phases that the stratigraphy of the city still records. For many hours, perhaps through the rest of the day and the first part of the night, pumice and ash fell continuously. In districts nearer the mountain, the depth grew to 2 or 3 cubits in only a few hours. Roofs that had been weakened by the earlier earthquake sagged and then failed. Porticos collapsed inward. Anyone who chose to shelter under a roof had to clear the weight constantly or move as rooms failed, one after another. Many did not try. Footprints preserved in ash show the first wave of flight. People moved along the main streets toward the gates, carrying children and small chests wrapped against the grit, hoping to reach the coastal road or the river landing before the drift deepened. Others made for interior courtyards and waited for the fall to cease. In the darkness before dawn, the violence changed. The column above the volcano lost its strength and collapsed. What rushed outward were clouds of ash and superheated gas, surges that hugged the ground and moved faster than any person could run. Herculaneum on the western flank, closer to the vent, had already been overwhelmed by earlier pyroclastic torrents. At Pompeii, the first surges lapped at the walls and withdrew. Later surges were stronger and higher. They found the gates and swept down the streets. The people who had survived the night by clearing pumice from roofs or by sheltering in cellars died in moments. Plaster casts made centuries later capture the contortions of those final seconds. The position of mouths and hands suggests that many succumbed to hot, ash-charged air that cut the breath and burned the lungs. In other places, the end came by weight and structure rather than heat. Beams gave way under loads of ash and stone, and the rooms around them folded. Tombs outside the walls show similar stories. The ash drifted around monuments and then leaped, leaving strange scalloped profiles that a geologist can read like a weather map. Pliny the Elder, admiral and encyclopedist, sailed from Misenum into this apocalypse. He ordered warships prepared, intending to bring aid and to study the phenomenon at close range. He reached the southern shore of the bay near Stabiae, reassured friends, and watched the cloud boil higher, peppered with fire. In the night, he tried to rest, but the courtyard's ash grew so deep that the retreating party tied pillows on their heads as makeshift helmets. He never returned to Misenum. His nephew writes that the elder Pliny collapsed on the beach, overcome by fumes and exertion. The nephew's letter to the historian Tacitus is our most careful ancient account. It has the tone of a young man who has seen the world change shape in a day, and who seeks in description the order that nature had withdrawn. When the surges ceased, the mountain still breathed ash and steam. Where the city had been, there was a rolling plain of grey, no longer quite level with the old landmarks. Here and there, ridges showed where roofs had lain. Much later, reports speak of survivors returning to search for doorways or for a family chest. In some places, they dug holes and tunnels and brought out what they could. The most famous loaves from a baker's oven bear a stamped seal and deep score marks for easy division. They were already baked when the fall began. Outside the Herculaneum gate, a small group of people tried to flee through a vineyard and fell together when the last surges arrived. Their garden has preserved them. In other quarters, a dog died still on its chain, twisted by final agonies that the plaster cast has fixed in wrenching clarity. The shock that began at midday had become, by the next afternoon, a sealed world. Over Pompeii lay several meters of volcanic material. pumice at the bottom and ash above, compacted by later rains into a crust that no plough could easily break. The ancient world forgot the city's name. The site was called La Civita, the Old Town, and it lay beneath vineyards and fields that benefited from the same soil that had nourished Pompeii in life. In the late 16th century, an engineer named Domenico Fontana cut a channel across the buried area to carry water for a new palace. He uncovered painted walls and inscriptions, but did not linger. The first systematic search arrived under the Bourbon kings of Naples in the 18th century. Work began at Herculaneum in the year 1738 and soon shifted to the easier ground of Pompeii in 1748. The earliest excavation was more treasure hunt than science. Tunnels were driven toward painted rooms. Bronzes and marbles were extracted as trophies for royal galleries. Baroque Europe was hungry for antiquity, and Pompeii fed the appetite. Method followed greed. Engineers such as Carl, Jacob, Weber, and later Francesco La Vega introduced plans and careful notes. They realized that a city was being unearthed whole, with its streets and water system and shops intact, and that only patient exposure could preserve meaning. In the year 1763, a stone inscription bearing the phrase of the city's public body confirmed the name Pompeii. Across Europe, the news produced an excited scholarship that mixed travel, connoisseurship, and careful description. The paintings and mosaics pulled antiquarian eyes, but it was the ordinary furniture of life that seized imaginations. Cooking pots, keys, stools, and lamps put flesh on the bones of Latin texts. The House of the Faun gave up its famous mosaic, showing Alexander driving against the Persian king. The Villa of the Mysteries outside the Herculaneum Gate opened a red-walled chamber whose life-size fresco sequence has fueled interpretations for generations. Tourists began to arrive, and patronage made careers. A city newly dead gave many modern men their livelihoods. The 19th century gave Pompeii its great organizer. In 1860, Giuseppe Fiorelli assumed charge and changed the enterprise from quarrying to archaeology. He divided the city into regions and blocks and gave every doorway a number, a simple system that turned a maze into an address. He recorded find spots and published reports that made the work verifiable. Most famously, he tried a compassionate experiment. Standing before a void in the ash where a body had decayed, he poured in liquid plaster and let it set. When the mold was cleared, he found himself looking at a human shape with face and garments creased into the cast. The technique, still used with modern refinements, transformed the moral tone of the site. No longer were the dead only items in a record. They were people caught in their last moments. Among the earliest casts were those of a group who died in a garden near the Porta Nocera, later called the Garden of the Fugitives. They lie in attitudes that need no caption. Fiorelli's successors built on his order. Vittorio Spinazzola, in the early 20th century, decided to excavate street fronts continuously, revealing whole commercial facades with doorways and balconies in a sequence that showed how a living street presented itself. A generation later, Amedeo Maiuri carried out large campaigns between the 1920s and the 1960s, opening major houses such as the House of the Menander and the House of the Surgeon, and connecting architectural history to the long story of the town from its Samnite roots to its colonial refounding. The Second World War brought bombs that shattered areas already exposed, and post-war conservation had to contend with damage from both antiquity and modernity. In 1997, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization inscribed Pompeii, Herculaneum, and the villas of Torre Annunziata as a World Heritage Site, recognizing that the ash had preserved not only art and buildings, but an entire urban fabric unique in the Roman world. Archaeology has since learned to speak more languages at Pompeii. The plantings in peristyle gardens are no longer recreations by taste alone. Pollen studies and seed catalogues from cavities in the soil allow faithful replanting of myrtle hedges, fruit trees, and herbs. Archaeobotanists have shown how vineyards were laid out and how the city grew skeptical crops in small courtyards to flavor kitchens. Specialists in animal remains have reconstructed menus and trade. Amphorae are no longer only shapes and stamps. Residue analysis can tell whether a jar held oil from one grove or a fish sauce from a particular factory, and in some cases can define the contents after 2 millennia. The study of tool marks on walls and beams clarifies which repairs belong to the frantic years after the earthquake of '62 and which belong to earlier periods. Plaster surfaces now preserve not only mural scenes, but the brush textures of ancient painters at work. The city has become a laboratory where every craft is on display. Conservation has been the other science. The buried city does not decay under ash, but once exposed it must be cared for like any masonry town that faces sun, rain, and wind. Roofs have been rebuilt over many rooms to keep water off extraordinary paintings and stucco. Lime mortars suited to ancient stone are used for repairs rather than modern cements that trap moisture. Drains have been reopened under streets so that winter storms do not drown pavements. In the second decade of the 21st century, a major program with European support stabilized walls, repaired long-neglected houses, improved drainage, and allowed new excavation in areas that connected the puzzle of whole neighborhoods. The work produced fresh finds. Lararia, with startlingly vivid painting, emerged from houses in the northern districts. A room painted in a deep red with theatrical masks made headlines. A bakery revealed the grim fact of slaves chained to mills. On one street, a wooden shrine survived as a charcoal silhouette impressed in the ash, leaving the ghost of a panel house, whose timbers could be measured as if they still stood. Some discoveries have rewritten details of the famous day. The charcoal date scribbled on a wall under repair, noted above, fixed at least one moment in mid-October. A coin found in a room sealed by the eruption carries a title of the Emperor Titus that likely was issued only after early autumn. Chestnuts and pomegranates found in kitchens and storerooms belong to an autumn pantry. No single item can compel certainty, but taken together they have convinced many that the catastrophe came in the cooler weeks of the year, when braziers were already lit in the evening and when heavier cloaks were closer at hand. That seasonal revision only deepens the pathos of casts that show people huddled in shawls and clutching at their faces as the surges reached them. Across the site, the casts continue to teach. The face of a man turned toward the ground, with hands raised in a posture that might be prayer or reflex. A woman cradling a child. A group who fell together outdoors, where the ash made dunes around vines. In one house, the imprint of a chest shows where someone tried to lift a small fortune and failed at the threshold. The dog on its chain speaks with a clarity that no inscription can rival. These are not only museum objects, they are singular human presences that obligate the living to care for the city that holds them. The modern guide who pauses in a garden to let a visitor stand with this knowledge does the same work as the ancient priest who explained a ritual. Both trade in memory. Why does Pompeii compel so completely? It is not the violence alone, though the violent preservation has created a density of evidence unmatched in the Roman world. The hold comes from the ordinariness made visible. The graffiti on a column that asks for votes for a baker. The tally marks scratched by a shopkeeper on a plaster wall. The hooks still set above a counter where lamps once hung. The grooves in a threshold worn by generations of sandals. The curse scrawled in a back room. The little altar in an atrium where a family poured wine and asked for protection. These are the survivors. They are the way a city keeps speaking after its people are gone. Pompeii is a ruin, but it is also a book that can still be read aloud. More than 2/3 of the city has been exposed. The rest remains buried beneath orchards and grass, a reminder that restraint can be a form of care. Archaeologists now open only where there is a question that must be answered, or a conservation problem that requires full excavation. The choice honors a duty to the future. The ash that killed also shelters. New instruments will someday draw more from the soil than ours can. Meanwhile, the city lives an odd second life. It receives millions of visitors, a number that would have been unimaginable to its ancient citizens. It must carry that weight without losing the delicacy of wall painting and the quiet of alleys where the sound of iron tires on stone can still be imagined. In the end, the story that began on a lava ridge above a river and a bay becomes a story about the uses of memory. Pompeii joins the register of places that teach by their survival and their loss. It tells us what a Roman city looked like behind its doors and under its paint. It shows us the daily rhythms of buying, bathing, worship, and work. It shows us the reach of empire in a marketplace, where fish from the bay lay beside fruit from inland orchards, and wine destined for far provinces sloshed in jars. It shows us a community that faced punishment and earthquake, repaired itself, and kept its nerve. And then it shows us the hour when all that steadiness met a power that no human institution could resist. The catastrophe preserved the evidence. Archaeology and careful stewardship have preserved the lesson.